the Gospel of John, and as I read it again, I'm amazed at what is said about Jesus and what he says about himself. It's just so rich in metaphors, talking about being the bread, the vine, the light of the world. And we get to chapter 8, and this chapter is a bit of a mind bender for me. And I'm not sure what Pastor Jim is going to do in the following weeks with it. But I want to give you a perspective that perhaps you might not see coming, but it's a perspective that has been on my mind for a number of years. And it's death, dying, and the resurrection of the body. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to start out by finding out where you are in that conversation or that thought. And so something I like to do here is fist to five. And if you remember, if you've been here before, you might remember this. Fist is absolute no. 5 fingers is yes, that's me. And then whatever number of fingers you want in the middle, 1, 2, or 3 if you're not sure. So I have a couple of statements that I want you to think about and physically show me about this idea of death, dying, and the resurrection of the body. So here's the first one. Remembering people who have died is important in our culture. That would be a no for me. Absolutely yes. Total agreement, 5, or whatever you want to do in between. Remembering people who have died is important in our culture, our Canadian culture. All right, good. My second question for you, a little bit more personal. Death is someone I know well. Experiencing death around me, people I know, is something I know well. Absolutely not at all. Okay, good. And my last question is this. I think about my own mortality, life and death, quite often. All the time, hardly ever. I think about my own mortality. All right, good. I want to talk about this subject today, and I want to start out by looking at funerals. And I'm hoping that all of you have been to a funeral. There might be some of you that haven't, and that's fine. But hopefully you either have seen one from a distance, know about one, or you were very closely involved. And I would like to know from you, and we're just going to kind of have a big discussion here for a couple minutes. Why are funerals important in our Canadian culture? Why do they matter? Why do we do them? Why do we go to them? Why do we take time to have a funeral? I'm just curious what you think about that. Yes, sir. Okay. Good. Doing something together. Yes, at the back. Good. Closure. Okay. Yes. Okay. So a send-off. Yes. Okay. Comfort other people. Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, that's an important idea. Yes? Good. A reminder. Yeah. Okay, hope. Yes? Okay. Good. Honor. Respect. This is what I want you to do. Just for a minute, maybe a minute and a half, find someone near you, and I want you to tell them your most memorable experience at a funeral? Funny, serious, sad, joyful. If you haven't been to one, then just listen. But if you have, share. What do you remember from a funeral you've been to? All right. Sounds like there's some good stories, some interesting ideas about funerals. Let me read the text to you that we're going to talk about today from John chapter 8. And we might come back to these conversations a little bit later. This is at the end of John 8, and Jesus has really been under a bit of an interrogation before the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, those men who upheld the Torah, the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, and they have been firing questions at him, and he has been answering, and there's this theme that he keeps coming back to again and again, and without actually saying it, I am God. He's been constantly throwing out these subtle ideas, these metaphors, these examples, talking about Abraham, talking about the Jewish people. And it's boiling to a climax. And at the end of chapter 8, we get this. Jesus replied, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him and obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. You are not yet 50 years old, they said to him, and you have seen Abraham? Very truly, I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. And then everything unravels. I want to look at this idea of death, dying, and the resurrection of the body through this connection that Jesus makes with Abraham. And in this text right here, he mentions Abraham twice. He says, Abraham was looking forward to me coming to earth. And secondly, I was around before Abraham like I've been around after Abraham. And how do we understand that? So, first of all, for the Pharisees, for the Jewish people in the first century, they had an understanding of the afterlife that is similar to some of the cultures that we know, similar to our culture, but it was unique because it began something that was totally new. For the first time, historically, a culture believed in the resurrection of the body. Now, cultures before and since have believed in reincarnation, that body taking on a new form, becoming something different. Cultures have believed in the termination of the body of the soul. It's no more. For the Greeks, there was the separation of the body and the soul. The body died, the spirit went to Hades. But the Jewish people developed this idea of the resurrection of this body. And when you died, you went to a place called Sheol, which was like the Greek Hades, or in the Middle Ages for the Catholic Church, Purgatory. It was a holding tank, so to speak, a waiting place, a waiting room. And you would remain there until your body would be resurrected with the coming of the Messiah. And when the Messiah was to come, everything would be changed. And they described it as Olah Abba. Say that with me. Olah Abba. That was the Hebrew for the world to come. What the Messiah would bring in for the righteous. And those who had died that were righteous would be resurrected, and the wicked would be would be dead once and for all. So this idea of this body being resurrected was really a new idea in human history, and it began with the Jewish people. Now, there were Jewish mystics that took this idea even further and said that it wasn't just going to happen at the end of time when the Messiah returned, but resurrection of the body would happen regularly, at special moments, maybe even constantly. There's this idea that all souls ever created were present at Mount Sinai when God gave Moses the commandments. And so these Jewish mystics took it one step further and said the resurrection of the body isn't just saved for what is to come, but it's happening now. And it's happening because there needs to be a healing of the world. And so the resurrection of the body was something that these Pharisees would have believed in and had thought about, but it seems to me in this example it wasn't very important. Because their response to Jesus, when he says, your father Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, so the guy in the history of the Jews, he was happy when he looked forward to me coming. So that idea of the living and the dead interacting, the Pharisees weren't really interested in hearing that because their response is, you're not even 50 years old. How could you have been around when Abraham was around? And then, of course, the bomb drops when Jesus says, I've been here the whole time. Before Abraham was here, I was here. After Abraham was here, I am here. And the text seems to indicate that there is some kind of a relationship between the living and the dead. Not only is Jesus beyond time, but in this Jewish tradition of the resurrection of the body, and in the Jewish mystic tradition of an ongoing resurrection, there seems to be some kind of a veil, a liminal space, an interaction between the visible and the invisible, the dead and the living, the spiritual and the physical. There seems to be something going on. And if we go back to Genesis 25, when Abraham dies, it says there that he was gathered to his people. Now, does that simply mean he was buried with those that were already dead? Yes. Could it mean more than that? He was gathered to his people. There was some kind of, perhaps not a resurrection of the body, but an interaction between those who had already died and Abraham who comes to meet them. Now, I want to put all of this in context for us today, because most of us here are methodical, scientific, disenchanted, we need proof kind of thinkers. And so let me walk you through the history of death and dying. And I want to go all the way back to the early church in the book of Acts in the first century. Those Jewish people who had become Christians and now were not waiting for the Messiah, but were following the Messiah. They were followers of Jesus. They were followers of the way. And in the very early church, in the first couple hundred years, Christians were part of a Roman empire, a Roman culture, and death really was a private affair. The dead were left to be buried quite quickly for all kinds of reasons, disease, practical reasons, and that was usually left to the people who were directly involved. There wasn't a lot of celebration. There wasn't a lot of ritual. And the Christians in the early church walk into this context, and they begin to wrestle. What do we do with our Christian sisters and brothers who have died? And so some traditions began to develop, and one of the most important ones was the Sacrament of Baptism. And when you were baptized into the church, that baptism signed and sealed that you had been delivered to God and that your resurrection of your body was guaranteed through what Jesus has done and that you would live eternally. And so the idea of death simply became a gate, a portal, an avenue to what was to come. The other tradition that began in the early church was this idea of the viaticum. which was simply the bread and the wine, the sacraments of the Lord's Supper, were given to someone dying to prepare them for the journey to their Creator. And then, of course, one of the big ones that began in the 4th century was the idea of saints. People who had died, usually as martyrs, people who had been connected to miracles, would be honored and remembered, and people would constantly talk, honor them, think about them in the church as a transition between the living and the dead. These saints were remembered for the living, but now they were dead in their bodily form, and they had moved to be with their Creator. And so some of these traditions began in the very, very early church. Then as we go into the Middle Ages of European history, things get really, really interesting. In the 12th century, the idea of purgatory developed. And if you know nothing about the Catholic tradition of the Christian church, purgatory really grew out of popular religion. People would look at deep, deep caves, for example, that had no bottoms. And legend and stories began to develop that they were gateways to the underworld. Or they would look at volcanoes like Mount Vesuvius in Italy and see fire and lava and death pouring out and have no idea what was causing that and say that's some kind of a portal to the underworld. So hell began to be viewed as down there. So if you've ever wondered why hell is down and heaven is up, that at least is the hell portion of the story. And out of the popular religion, people began to think, when I die, I will be traveling physically below the surface of the earth. And what will happen when I'm judged? How do I know that I will be saved? And through all kinds of different events, ideas, stories, folklore, the Catholic Church finally, in the 13th century, said, what are we going to do with this? And they began to try to get their hands on it and their fingers on it. And they began to look to Scripture, and in particular, Luke chapter 16, the story of Lazarus and the rich man. And if you're not familiar with that story, Lazarus is a poor beggar, and he sits outside of the house of a rich man and begs for food. And they both die, and they end up in the afterlife. And it says that Lazarus is taken to Abraham's side, and there, with the righteous and the angels, he is comforted. And across a chasm, he sees the rich man that he begged from every day of his human life. And the rich man calls out and says, I'm thirsty, I'm suffering. Lazarus, do something. And Lazarus can't because they're separated. And the rich man says, at least go back to my family and warn them. And from that text and a couple of others in the New Testament, the church began to develop this idea of what happens when we die. When you did die in the Middle Ages, you thought very seriously about what was going to happen to you as you crossed from the physical to the spiritual. Not only was your life difficult, not only was your lifespan short, but death was very much on your mind. And in the Middle Ages, the most important thing that you could do was have the good death. And the good death meant that when you got close to actually dying, when you felt that you were on your deathbed, the priest would be called. And he would come to your bedside, and taking the authority of the church, he would administer the last rites. And the last rites would be praying for you, offering you communion, the bread and the wine, if you could take it, or taking it on your behalf, and then administering the extreme unction, which was the anointing of your body with oil, your hands, your feet, your lips, your eyes, your back, and you would be anointed. And then finally, the priest would prepare your soul for eternity by praying and reading psalms. And that was the way you wanted to die, because your whole life had been about preparing for judgment, preparing for the sin that you had not thought about, or the sin that you had committed since baptism, the mortal sins that perhaps were they forgivable or not, and you wanted to confess as much of that sin as you could before you died. Because any sin that you took with you to the afterlife, to purgatory, meant more time for you to be refined, to be purified, to be made right before God. So death was in the forefront of your mind. You wanted to have that good death. Well, after the Protestant Reformation, separation from the Catholic Church, there is a change in the way people think about not only their faith and the church, but the way they think about death and dying. And as people acquired wealth, as economies changed, as nations were born, the authority moved from the priest at your deathbed to your family at your deathbed. And during the 16th and 17th century, and even on into the 18th century, what mattered the most was that as you were dying on your deathbed, your family, those you loved, your friends were gathered around you. And the person who took the authority and ran the show, so to speak, was not a priest or even a family member. It was the person dying. So the whole notion of a last will and testament, final words, advice, began in this period of history. And what the family and friends would do is they would open the doors of the room, the bedroom, and they would allow death to come in, to take that person. And so death and dying became a little bit more private, a little bit more individual, and a little bit more disconnected from the church. That brings us up to today, the 20th century. Not quite today. And now, in the last 100 years, most people die with strangers. Most people die in hospitals. If you haven't read the obituaries, read them. One of the most intriguing things about obituaries is 9 out of 10 obituaries in the newspaper will say they died in peace. In the Middle Ages, you died screaming. Today, we die in peace because we're medicated in a hospital. We're given painkillers or we're unconscious, and we die in a room under white linen, maybe hooked up to a machine. We may have family there when we pass away. It may not happen. It might just be a nurse or a doctor. And in the last 100 years, our understanding of death and dying has really, really changed. It's become very sanitized. It's become very impersonal. It's become very, very disconnected. It's only been in the last 20, 30 years with the hospice movement where people have begun to understand the importance of dying at home, dying with friends, perhaps not dying under the care or the medicine of a doctor or a nurse. So death and dying has changed a lot. And so when we look at this Jewish culture and what Jesus is trying to present to the Pharisees, I think for most of us, trying to wrap our heads around that is a little disconcerting and maybe a little bit difficult, because death and dying in our society is really very different. We buy insurance. We go to funeral homes. A friend of mine, he was a pastor in Alberta, and someone in his church died, and he looked into it because the family didn't have a lot of money, and they were trying to be as frugal as possible. And he discovered in the province of Alberta anyway that you couldn't die for less than $6,000. That's just how much it costs to get a casket, to documentation, to go through the coroner. There's fees and there's costs to dying. And dying in North America has become a great way to make money. There's a lady in my church. Her father died about 10 years ago, and I remember talking to her after her dad died. And her comment, and it still boggles my mind to this day, was, "Yeah, I'm glad I got that insurance policy. I got $100,000 when my dad died." And when she said that, I didn't even know how to respond. Since then, I've realized that we just think about death and dying very differently today. And that's beginning to change, but it hasn't always been that way. So, we come back to what Jesus said. And if he is the great I am, if he was alive before Abraham was born, if he transcends time, is outside of death and dying, at least in his divinity, not his humanity, but in his divinity, then what does that mean for us today, where we might die in a hospital or in a hospice, or we might die at home? People who have died before us, what do we do with this? I want you to look at the picture that you picked up. I want us to start wrestling with this for a moment. Most of you should have a picture of one person. I want you to think about who they are, where they are when that picture was taken, who their family might be, how old they are, what their job is, do they have an education, are they poor, are they rich, are they talented? Some of your pictures, you can get little clues that will help you with that. Some of you would just have to straight up imagine who they are. But I can tell you with quite an amount of certainty that the person you're looking at is no longer living. There might be a few exceptions, but I know where all these pictures came from, and they're all 50 or 60 years old, the pictures themselves. And most of the people that you're looking at this morning have died. So, if this is true, what kind of interaction do we experience with the dead? And I'm not talking about ghosts. In the Middle Ages, they would have. But is there a resurrection of the body that's going on? Is there a way for us to understand those who have died? On Tuesday was Remembrance Day. And I don't know if you went to a service at a cenotaph. I did. I went to Fort Langley this year. And I've never been to Fort Langley. I've been to Aldergrove. I've been to the one in Langley City here. And for sure, the one at Fort Langley is my favorite. And the reason it's my favorite is because it's in a cemetery. And to get to the actual service, you have to walk through a cemetery. And for most of us today, that's not something we would choose to do. Generally, we avoid cemeteries. The media and Hollywood have made them creepy and spooky and haunted and uncomfortable. Cemeteries are very expensive for us to bury people in. Often people will cremate bodies instead. But to be in a cemetery and to be there with my children was a really unique experience. And there was probably about 3,000 people there in this cemetery. And as always on Remembrance Day, I'm amazed at what happens. How we come together as a community, as Canadians, to honor the dead. And I really do believe that we do hear their voices through the people who speak, through the wreaths that are laid, to the songs that we sing. The service this year at Fort Langley was overtly, clearly Christian. I so appreciated that about what was said. There was no denying from what was said and what was sung that we are here as creatures who have been created by a living God. And how do we honor and remember the people that have gone before us? And so as I stood there in that cemetery, taking all of this in, I couldn't help but think, we are gathered here in probably one of the only ways we do in our society now, in Canadian society, to remember the dead and to listen to their stories and to recognize that perhaps There's more going on than we recognize. Perhaps the veil between those who are dead and those who are living is thinner than we care to think about or care to imagine. And perhaps when Jesus said, I was before Abraham, I am now after Abraham, let me suggest that maybe that was an indication that the veil between life and death is very thin. And our understanding of what it means to die and how we die and how we remember those who have died, I wonder if Jesus is asking us to think a little bit differently. Because the gospel is clear. This body, in some form, I don't know how, will be resurrected. I don't have to suggest that. It's there. All through the Gospels and the letters of the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about it a great deal, the resurrection of the body. And he gives us a few little hints and a few little clues that just as Jesus' body was resurrected, just as Jesus is beyond death, so too our bodies can be that way. Like the mystic Jews, perhaps it's not just what is to come. Perhaps we are living in spaces where the dead need to be remembered, where the dead speak to us, not in a voice like mine, but speak to us through their memories, speak to us through their family. Maybe we need to listen to that. I want to close with this one verse from 1 Corinthians 15 that I think just sums it all up. Paul says, I tell you a mystery. Not all of you will sleep, but all of you will be changed. And that is the promise, the hope in the resurrection of Jesus. He is the great I am. He is eternal. And we, in some shape or form, have been created for eternity.